Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the 22nd Annual Family Cafe. I'm Jeremy Countryman, Program Director, and I have Joe McCann,
Good morning.
Policy Manager, here with us this morning. Of course, it's not just a regular day here in the virtual Family Cafe. It is Keynote Friday. So we had the first of our three keynotes last Friday with Zach Gottsigan from the Peanut Butter Falcon. Today, we're really excited to deliver the second of our three keynotes. It's going to be with Bobby Silverstein, somebody who was deeply involved in the creation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law 30 years ago. So we want to get straight to the keynote as soon as we can. Just a couple quick reminders before we do that. Remember, we sent you a pink card and a report card. Send those back to us with your return address for a free gift while supplies last. So please do take advantage of that opportunity to let us know how we're doing and let the state know what your questions are about their service delivery system. And the other thing I want to mention real quick is we're going to be back at 2 o'clock this afternoon with Barbara Palmer from the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Joe, who's going to tell us a little bit about Bobby, and then we're going to throw it over to Bobby.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just for a quick introduction for Bobby. Bobby Silverstein is a nationally recognized attorney with over 45 years of public policy and advocacy experience. For more than a decade, he served as staff director and chief counsel for the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy, chaired by Senator Tom Harkin. Bobby was a behind-the-scenes architect of more than 20 disability-related bills enacted into law, including the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act. Also, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act as amended. Bobby is the recipient of more than 15 national awards, including the Distinguished Service Award from the President of the United States for his work on the ADA. Bobby has been also inducted into the Public Interest Hall of Fame. Bobby, welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the honor of presenting today at the 26th Annual Family Cafe. My topic will be disability advocacy, securing the American dream for all. Next slide, please. As you all know, July 26, 2020 is a very, very special day. It is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA has been called by many folks around the world as the 20th century Emancipation Proclamation for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. On July 13th, 1990, I had the incredible privilege of sitting next to Senator Tom Harkin, the chief sponsor of the ADA, and watch him debate the final passage of the ADA. Now, this debate was like none other that the Congress had ever seen, because Senator Harkin used sign language only in part of his debate. And we'd like to share with you now a brief clip. And that young person sitting next to Senator Harkin is an early version of me.
Mr. President.
We're just having a small issue with the sound. We're getting that ironed out right now. Please just stand by momentarily.
Mr.
There we go.
President, I thank the chair's indulgence for permitting me perhaps to say something that only a few people understood. But I wanted to do that as sort of a special way of thanking a very special person in my life who taught me at a very early age that people with disabilities could do anything that they set their minds to do, and that people should be judged on the basis of their abilities and not on the basis of their disabilities. In sign language, I just wanted to say to my brother Frank that today was my proudest day in 16 years in Congress. That today Congress opens the doors to all Americans with disabilities. That today we say no to fear, that we say no to ignorance, and that we say no to prejudice. The ADA is indeed the 20th century Emancipation Proclamation for all Americans with disabilities. Today, the U.S. Senate will say to all Americans that the days of segregation and inequality are over. And as I said, by your winning your full civil rights, you strengthen ours.
Wow. That was quite an emotional speech. And for me personally, I will never forget it. To have had the ability and to be experienced on the Senate, to experience Senator Harkin's incredibly powerful statements where he is saying yes to treating people with dignity and respect, yes to empowerment, and yes to judging people based on their abilities. Next slide. I was also privileged to be at the signing ceremony on the South Lawn of the White House. 3,000 people with disabilities, their family members, advocates, and others, and experienced the powerful statement by President George Herbert Walker Bush: let the shameful walls of exclusion come tumbling down. Next slide, please. An anniversary is a time to celebrate and a time to reflect. Next line, please. In my presentation today, I want to share with you some of the reasons to celebrate these policy successes. What are some of these policy successes? Next bullet. And also how and why the ADA became law. We need to focus on some of the lessons learned as advocates. Next bullet. And that's why I want to, after I focus on the specifics of the ADA and why it was enacted, we'll generalize to share some lessons learned for future advocacy efforts. Next slide. Here's the most important aspect of the passage of the ADA for advocacy, for trying to change the approach that policymakers have toward people with disabilities. We had an old paradigm or an old approach to disability policy in this country. And the old principles and values suggested that people with disabilities were defective, they were dependent, they were incapable. And as a result of that perception, policymakers were totally okay with isolating people with disabilities, segregating them, and pitying them. Let me give you some quick examples. In a Wisconsin Supreme Court, a child with cerebral palsy, his name was Merritt, was excluded from public education. His parents sued. The courts looked at this issue, the case, and decided that it was perfectly acceptable to exclude Merritt from public education. Why? Because, quote, his presence produces a depressing and nauseating effect upon the teachers and school children, and his presence is, quote, harmful to the best interests of the school. This case was obviously before IDEA. In another case, the US Supreme Court had to decide whether it was okay to involuntarily sterilize a woman with a developmental disability. And the Supreme Court said, absolutely, it's okay to sterilize this person against her will, quote, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crimes or let them starve for their imbecility, society can and must prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. We had ugly laws in this country on the books until the 1970s, where people who, quote, were disease maimed or in any way deformed were not allowed in the public. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania established an institution, and these are the words in the legislation. The institution, quote, shall be devoted to the segregation of epileptic, idiotic, imbecile, and feeble-minded persons. Justice Oliver Wendell, Justice Thurgood Marshall in another Supreme Court decision called our public policy toward people with disabilities grotesque. Next slide. The ADA is so important because it totally rejects these old principles and values and substitutes a new set. And these words are in the ADA, and then they're repeated in the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Rehab Act, the Developmental Disabilities Act. These are powerful words that need to guide advocates and to make sure that policymakers reject the old approach and accept this new approach, that disability is a natural and normal part of the human experience that in no way diminishes a person's right to fully participate in all aspects of society. Next slide. And the focus needs to be on fixing the environment, not fixing the person with a disability. The environment is the built environment in terms of buildings, facilities, vehicles, transportation, and communication environment. Next slide. What the ADA says is that disability rights are civil rights. Reject the old notion of disability equals charity and pity. Disability rights are civil rights. Next slide. And include the various bullets on this page. When we look at the ADA policy successes, we recognize that state and local government services must be accessible. They must be appropriate. That means individualized care and treatment. That means focusing on facts, objective evidence, science, best practices. It means focusing on people's strengths and abilities and capabilities. They must be effective and meaningful. That means appropriate in the education context. That means reasonable accommodations in the employment context. And they must be provided in the most integrated setting. And so how does this translate? Next slide. It means in competitive integrated employment is the presumed and priority placement for youth and adults with disabilities. It's the default, competitive integrated employment. Next slide. Construction of new facilities must be successful. Next slide. We're talking about new buses, new trains, all modes of communication, transportation be accessible. Next bullet. We're talking about that employers' diversity and inclusion initiatives must include people with disabilities. So neurodiversity as initiatives are now commonplace in many large companies. Next slide. Websites, mobile apps, online systems, which are so critical to our country now, they must be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. This is not always happening. We're still early on. There are still many companies that have not embraced this, but this is a critical component that we are moving in the right direction. Next slide. And now we have some new issues that are occurring, but ADA provides us with handles to address these new challenges. Next bullet. We're in the midst of COVID-19. We found that some folks that were on ventilators or in hospitals were denied ventilators because of disability, because folks were rationing healthcare based on preconceived notion about disability. And because of the ADA, the Office for Civil Rights and HHS said to Alabama, said to Pennsylvania, no, that is not okay. You can make healthcare decisions, but not based on quality of life determinations. Just a couple of days ago, Connecticut was required to change its visitation policies so that folks who were provided support, like interpreters, were allowed in to be with the individual. Next slide. We have artificial intelligence being used to screen applicants. But if this AI has algorithm bias, people who don't look and talk like the quote average person will be denied the opportunity to be considered, notwithstanding their qualifications. We are using ADA to make sure that these folks are not doing using AI to screen out folks. Next bullet. We are looking at our autonomous vehicles, and because of the ADA, there are requirements that state and local governments who purchase transportation, private sector like Uber and Lyft, if they're going to purchase autonomous vehicles, they must make sure they are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. Next slide. Now, I'm not, next bullets too, I'm not being Pollyannish. I know that there is not full implementation out there. There are violations all over this country. We need to recognize that implementation of the ADA is a journey. Next bullet. This journey toward full and complete compliance is going to be ongoing. We're never going to reach the promised land. But, next bullet, we do need to have vigilance, commitment, courage, and persistence to transform the promise of the ADA into a reality. This is the part that's depressing but real. Our role as advocates never stops. Passing a law gives us handles, gives us the opportunity, but we have to be understanding that exercising that right is, to pardon my French, is always going to be a pain in the ass. We're always going to have to be vigilant. Next slide. Now we're going to switch from the successes to talk about the history. How did the ADA go from an idea to a bill to a law? Thousands and thousands of bills are introduced every year, and most go absolutely nowhere. In fact, in a typical 2-year Congress, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 400 bills will make it to the finish line and become law. Next bullet. So why then did the advocacy for the ADA succeed? Next slide. The answer involves 2 overarching issues: establishing a broad-based coalition, and secondly, having a comprehensive strategic plan. Next slide. In the ADA case, we had a cross-disability coalition. They met every Friday at a local church. They closed the door. They yelled at each other. They screamed at each other. They eventually reached consensus and then walked out of the door united. They were a cohesive force. They recognized that we needed to stay together. We also, in this case, went to the civil rights community and this religious community because we were saying that disability rights are civil rights. There was a leadership mechanisms set up. So we had generals in charge of everything. We had folks who worked on drafting legislation. We had lobbyists. We had folks dealing with the media. We had folks dealing with grassroots. These were the working task forces that made it happen. And there was ongoing communication with the disability community so that folks around the country and the world knew what was happening. Next slide, please. We recognized the central role played by the disability community. You've all heard the expression, nothing about us without us. Well, nothing happened without the disability community in the discussions and negotiations on the ADA. We recognized that this was not just another law. This was a law for people with disabilities, and they had to be the folks who said yes, no, when we made compromises. This was their bill, and we all recognized that. I, as a staff person, the senators, the other policymakers. But we also recognized that if this bill was going to become law, we needed to have effective communication with the stakeholders, the business community, employers, state and local governments. We needed to pass a law that not only recognized the civil rights of people with disabilities, but provided an appropriate balance to address legitimate concerns by these various stakeholders. Personally, I refer to this strategy as radical pragmatism. Radical in terms of making fundamental change. Pragmatism in recognizing the legitimate concerns of stakeholders. Next slide. We recognized there needed to be a compelling case if we're going to have such a landmark legislation enacted. The National Council on Disability wrote a comprehensive report called Toward Independence, identifying the history of discrimination faced by people with disabilities. They wrote a second book on the threshold report on the threshold of independence, which actually drafted a comprehensive disability rights law called the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We had a Justin Dart, who is the Martin Luther King Jr. of the disability rights movement, go around the country collecting discrimination diaries. We had the AIDS Commission report about the issues from the perspective of those with AIDS and HIV. We had extensive testimony. Next slide. We recognize the importance of making the case on a bipartisan basis. The ADA would not have happened without bipartisanship. It started with President George Herbert Walker Bush. He endorsed on multiple occasions the notion of a comprehensive civil rights statute. We had 12 Reagan appointees on the National Council on Disability recommend the ADA. We had a bipartisan bill, Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, introduce a bill. Bipartisanship is a critical strategy for moving disability policy, and we made every effort possible to make sure that our discussions remain bipartisan. Next slide. Here's a nuance that is important. Sometimes you have a bill that is just there to make a point, to make sure that an issue gets on the agenda, but there's no effort to actually move it. The original ADA was introduced in the spring, right before Congress ended. We did it for one purpose and one purpose only, not to get it passed, but that version was introduced so that the presidential candidates talked about disability policy, and it worked. President Bush did that during his campaign when he was a candidate and then when he was elected. But once you're ready to move a bill, it is really critical that you control the message, that it can withstand scrutiny by balancing rights and legitimate concerns. So you've got to make some, quote, compromises if you know that bill is moving towards passage. It's got to recognize rights and legitimate concerns in this case. Next slide, please. And in our case, we had something called Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which said non-discrimination by recipients of federal assistance. We could have described the ADA as landmark legislation, the Emancipation Proclamation, the most important bill for people with disabilities ever. But while we were doing it, we said, all we're doing is extending rights and protections that already exist to deal with more entities. We didn't want to scare people while it was under consideration. We wanted it to go smoothly. And so we had to figure out what our rhetoric was going to be. The next slide. We had to identify champions, the policymakers. That's why we started at the top, President George Herbert Walker Bush. We needed to have him on board. We had, fortunately, Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, who had a son with significant disabilities. He became a champion that we went to on many occasions. And with both President Bush and Attorney General Thornburgh, family was the critical issue because they personally understood disability. President Bush had folks with learning disabilities in his family. Senator Harkin had a brother who was deaf. Senator Kennedy had a son who lost one leg to cancer, who had a sister with a developmental disability. Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah, had a nephew with significant physical disabilities. We recognized and made sure that our champions understood disability personally. Sometimes family members don't, so they have friends and neighbors who do. You've got to figure out a way of finding champions who understand these issues personally. Next slide. Of course, we conducted hearings, and at every hearing, we made sure that the first witness was a person with a disability and/or a family member. This is where you make the case of personal stories to get to people's heart and soul before you get to their head, and that is to explain the policy objectives. Next slide. We needed to negotiate with the White House. The way things worked is the Senate met on 15 different occasions with folks from the White House, representatives, including a meeting in Senator Dole's office where all the principals got together. And we had a markup of a bill that was bipartisan. It had the support of the White House. Therefore, we had a 16-0 vote in committee and passed it easily on the Senate floor. And then it got stuck. It was not moving in the House. And sometimes it's important, next slide, to recognize that you need to have rallies. You need, next bullet, please. We may need to have demonstrations. And in the case of the ADA, some of you may be aware, there was something called the Capitol Crawl, where people got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the Capitol with a symbol of inaccessibility is unacceptable. And shortly thereafter, the House moved and passed its bill. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, in the course of any negotiation, you're going to find problems. You're going to have crises that occur. And we had a big one in terms of the ADA. The Senate passed its bill that said treat people with dignity and respect and look at facts, objective evidence, and science. The House passed its version of the ADA, said treat people based on dignity and respect, treat people based on fact, objective evidence, and science, except if you're HIV positive and a food handler, in which case it is perfectly acceptable to treat people with dignity, with discrimination. It's okay to discriminate against people who are HIV positive and food handlers. Next slide. Next bullet. That's what was in the House. Next bullet. There was a motion to instruct the Senate conferees to accept the House provision codifying discrimination, and it passed, notwithstanding strong advocacy by Senator Harkin, Senator Kennedy, and others. Next slide. But fortunately, you don't have to accept the instructions. And what happened is after this occurred and the instruction passed like 65-35, and Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah, Republican, voted to instruct the Senate to take the House conferees. But then what happened is Senator Hatch reconsidered. He was approached by folks who he trusted, who convinced him that this was not an appropriate thing to put in a civil rights statute for people with disability, codifying discrimination. And he agreed to include language. Next 3 bullets, please. He agreed to take a profiling courage to actually say, that's not okay in a civil rights statute. We need to let science decide. So he crafted a language that said, treat people based on dignity and respect, make decisions based on fact, objective evidence, and science, and we really mean it. Now, that wasn't the exact language in the statute, of course. The language in the statute said, let the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention decide the science. And that's what happened. Now, throughout this time, the disability community could say, we have a statute, we have an ADA, we can get it passed. So what if folks with HIV, you have this minor provision, are not protected? But the disability community recognized that they had to stay together. They had to support all people with disabilities, and they stayed together the whole time. This was an incredible experience to have watched the community stick together, and even though they thought the potential for losing it all was there. Next slide. And so, next bullets, we were able to get a House vote with this provision, overwhelming support, Senate, overwhelming support. Next slide. And I want to just take a minute now to read from the Senate floor debate, a dedication that Senator Harkin made. I want to make a dedication. All across our nation, mothers are giving birth to infants with disabilities. So I want to dedicate the ADA to these, the next generation of children and their parents. This is the ADA generation. With the passage of the ADA, we as a society make a pledge, next slide, that every child with a disability will have the opportunity to maximize his or her potential to live proud, productive, and prosperous lives in the mainstream of our society. Next slide. We love you all and welcome you into the world. We look forward to becoming your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers. We say whatever you decide as your goal, go for it. The doors are open and the barriers are coming down. This is what it's all about. The ADA generation, hopefully having rights and opportunities, and if those rights are still denied, to have the handles to make things right. Next slide. Final passage, July 26, signing ceremony. Wonderful experience. Next bullet after that. And then we had regs, training, technical assistance, monitoring, and enforcement. And that's all ongoing. Next slide. So what are the lessons we've learned that can be used on any advocacy effort that is made? What are some of the lessons? Number one, get involved. Justin Dart has said get involved as if your life depended on it, because it does in the lives of your friends and neighbors with people with disabilities. We have learned over and over that people can make a difference. Next. Second, it's critical to make a compelling case. You just can't say, I have a problem, solve it. You have to make the case to the policymaker. Next slide. Third, next bullet. We need coalitions. Big issues need broad-based coalitions. You can't do it by yourself. Next bullet. But you're going to compromise along the way. You need to articulate the values and principles that are going to guide your advocacy. Next page. Embrace bipartisanship whenever possible. Disability is one of those areas that historically has been bipartisan. You've got to seize that. That is a strategy that can make a difference. You need a plan. It should be specific, immediate, realizable, and actionable. These are the core guiding principles for a strategic plan. Next slide. We talked about radical pragmatism. That's another way of explaining something that's specific, immediate, realizable, and actionable. It's got to be, it may be radical in terms of changing how people view people with disabilities. It may be as radical as going from people with disabilities are defective and in need of fixing to disabilities a natural part of the human experience. That is fundamental, but we have to be pragmatic as well to get things done, to balance rights and legitimate concerns. Go back, please. So radical pragmatism was the first bullet. Next bullet, we need our personal stories to policy objectives. This is a critical strategy. Get to people's hearts before you get to their heads. So get your stories, but make sure they tell the right story. The best story is there was a problem, there was an actual policy intervention, and the problem was addressed. That's the best personal story, because policy makers can see if we do something, it will have a return on investment. And most importantly, we need to develop ongoing trust relationships with policymakers and staff. They need to know you. They need to be able to trust you. Oftentimes people ask me as an advocate, what's your goal? My goal is to get a policymaker or their staff to call me rather than for me to set up a meeting. I have reached the promised land when I get a call from a policymaker, but that takes developing trust, and that is so critical. Next slide. And you know something? We're always looking at the next issue to advocate for. We need to stop with our friends and neighbors and celebrate victories along the way. We need to be able to laugh, to enjoy, to have fun as well. And that's hard because in many cases, there are so many issues that have not been addressed. Next bullet. We need to recognize that we're never going to reach the promised land of equality and inclusion. It's going to be a journey, and that journey is going to be ongoing. Last slide, please, Nick. This is the call to action. My friend and colleague, Justin Dart, who, as I said, it was the Martin Luther King Jr. of the disability rights movement, said, and I quote, "Let us unite in action, but each in our own way. Some may make this a 24/7. Some may just respond to an action alert, each in our own way. We have a dream. We need to have a vision. Join us in creating a society where everyone wins, and join us in keeping the sacred American pledge: one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Next slide. Together, let us transform the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, into the ADA, the American dream for all. Thank you. And the last slide is my contact information if anybody would like to get in touch with me. Thank you again for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and feelings with you today.
Thanks very much, Bobby. That's a very informative presentation. I think it's great that you included a lot of practical advocacy advice that, you know, people here in Florida can use when they're talking to their own legislators and elected officials. I just want to remind everybody again, you can certainly submit your questions and comments in the comment field in the Facebook video, and we'll have somebody sharing those with us so we can ask Bobby on your behalf. I know right now Joe's collected a couple of things that have come through over the last few minutes. Let's go to those.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. Bobby, I can't resist with you here kind of asking you to take us just a little bit behind the scenes, you know, real time back then. And, you know, you talked a lot about compromise, how important that is. And, you know, that's hard. I mean, that's really hard. And but what was the biggest compromise that you guys had to make? You know, either one that ended up happening or maybe one that you just didn't want to make. Take us back to that time, and what were some of the really hardest decisions you had to make from a policy standpoint when you were doing those markups and putting those bills together?
Great. Well, let me give you behind the scenes. And so we'll talk about the actual situation and the example of a particular policy issue. We were sitting in Senator Bob Dole's office. The young folks may not know Senator Dole. Senator Dole was physically injured in World War II, had a significant disability, ran for president, and unlike FDR, actually did commercials embracing his disability as making a difference in his life. So we were all sitting, and he was the minority leader at that time. He was in a room. He invited Senator Kennedy, the chairman of what's now called the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Senator Harkin, who was the chief sponsor of the ADA, Senator Orrin Hatch, who was the Republican ranking member of the committee, David Durenberger, who was a member of the committee, Republican. We had Attorney General Dick Thornburgh there, Governor Sununu, who was the chief of staff for President George Herbert Walker Bush, the Secretary of Transportation. And we were negotiating the final, trying to get agreement between the administration. One of the key issues was existing buildings for public accommodations. Should there be any right to access to existing buildings, or should it only be new construction? And this was a big deal, a very big deal. And the issue, nuance of that was, in small buildings, would you have to install an elevator? And this was actually, we were stuck on this issue. And Governor Sununu was irate about the draft bill. He's, again, the chief of staff. And he was saying things that were actually not the case in terms of how we dealt with accessibility of buildings. And I whispered to Senator Harkin, can I say something to correct him? And he said, sure. And I said, Governor Sununu, on page 12, we have negotiated with your colleagues in Republicans in the Senate, and we've come up with a way of approaching this. Existing buildings must only make changes if they're readily achievable, easily accomplishable without much difficulty or expense. And alterations, if their effect are significant, and new construction, again, alterations and new, will deal differently with a set of standards that exist in this country and around the world. And he started screaming at me in response, screaming at me. Senator Kennedy, who's at the other end of the table, started getting red and said, Governor Sununu, you don't treat my staff this way. Who do you think you are? And Governor Sununu says, let's get rid of staff. And Senator Kennedy says, sure, you leave the room. You're not elected, you're appointed. And Senator Hatch said, let's all calm down. And what happened was all of the Republicans in the room were so pissed off at how Governor Sununu had acted. We had a deal, not only on this issue, but the whole ADA, because he was so obnoxious.
Wow. Bobby, you do not disappoint with your answer. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, it feels like we were in the room.
I know. I'm stressed.
Speaking of people sort of getting their tempers flared up a little bit, I wanted to ask you about something a little bit outside the ADA. And I know it was mentioned in your bio that you had a role in the passage of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. And of course, Section 504, people are familiar with 504 plans. That's where that comes from. And I know there was a big fight about Section 504. We actually had Judy Heumann as a keynote speaker last year, and she talked a little bit about that. And it's also a big part of that film Crip Camp that's been popular on Netflix in the last couple of months. That whole fight's depicted there. So I was just curious if you could tell us a little bit about what your role was in that whole process and kind of what that experience was like from your perspective.
Judy fought for the regulation and with her colleagues. And that's what's depicted in the movie, that there had to be a demonstration, there had to be a sit-in to get these 504 regs published. Once they were published, one of my first jobs was working in the Department of then called Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, Office for Civil Rights, to actually write policy guidance to help explain the nuances of what was in the regs. So I was not involved in the demonstrations. I was involved in helping write the policy after the reg was published. And then after I left, I actually wrote a policy manual and trained all the HEW Office for Civil Rights officials around the country on how to implement the ADA regulations. I'm sorry, the 504 regulations.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Bobby, we're about headed to the top of the hour here. So just maybe one more. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about advocacy for a minute. It's something that we talk a lot about here. And I appreciate one specific thing you said, talking about, trust. And can you just talk about that a little bit more? I loved it when you said that the thing you seek is to have a policymaker call you. I mean, I couldn't agree more. You're absolutely right, to be that trusted. But I mean, just from an advocacy standpoint, from where you sat doing this, how did that play out? I mean, that is just so important. And can you just expand on that a little bit?
There are two kinds of advocacy. One is you have a position for your organization and you push it to the hilt. That's it. This is my position. The second kind of advocacy is to be able to say to a policymaker or staff, listen, this is our position. Here are some other positions that people have taken. Here's why the pros and cons of this, what's legitimate, what's not. Can I help you get information to help you make an informed decision? That's technical assistance. If you ask me which form of advocacy is more powerful, it's the second, not the first. Mm-hmm. It is the ability to provide the policymaker or staff with the information they need. And if you do that, you better provide appropriate, comprehensive information, not totally slanted. If your position, if there are legitimate concerns, share those and explain how possibly not your official position, but another approach that addresses the same issue, interests, and concerns. Advocates are too stuck on their positions as opposed to the underlying issues and concerns. If you can focus on why you have a position and recognize there might be another way of accomplishing the same interest and concern, you're in much better shape.
Yeah, absolutely. No.
Yeah, definitely some practical advice that the advocates out here in our audience today can apply in their own efforts. So thank you for that.
Yes, Bobby, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here with us today, and that was hugely valuable. Thank you, and thank you for all you did and all you continue to do.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks again for inviting me to share some thoughts with you today.
Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, everybody, for tuning in. I just want to remind you one more time before we sign off that we will be back at 2 o'clock this afternoon, where we're going to have a visit from Barbara Palmer, Director of the Agencies for Persons with Disabilities. So definitely come back for that Friday afternoon session, and we will see you then. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. See you at 2.